Well, it's 7 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Glenn Moots. I'm a professor here on the Michigan campus and also director of the Forum for Citizenship and Enterprise, who's hosting tonight's lecture by Professor Mark Hall. Let me remind you first to silence your cell phones. And also, there is a memorial tonight at 8 o'clock, and if you're interested in going to the memorial, which I think is very important if you want to be there, our plan tonight is that Professor Hall is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and at that point, we'll excuse anybody that wants to head over to the memorial at 8 o'clock. Anyone that wants to stick around for Q&A, you're welcome to stick around, and Mark will be happy to answer any questions and engage in some dialogue. So I just want to let you know that if you're heading over to the memorial, don't worry, you can still make it over there. I just ask that you not leave until Mark's done, obviously, and that way we won't have any disruption. Well, tonight's theme reminds us that there are lots of changes in America. In a way, a social revolution, which if you kind of go back and look at the media over the last 10 or 20 years, is not terribly surprising, but in other ways is something of a social revolution. And revolutions have a habit of rewriting not only our laws and our political landscape, but also the status of rights. And we see this, for example, in the case of, I believe her name is Kim Davis, who announced this morning she's a clerk in the state of Kentucky. She refused to issue same-sex marriage licenses. She requested a stay from the Supreme Court. That was referred by Justice Kagan to the entire court. The court denied her stay. She said this morning she is going to continue not to issue those licenses. The case of Sweet Cakes by Melissa, probably the highest profile case of persons who on religious grounds refuse to facilitate in some way same-sex marriage on religious grounds. They found themselves in trouble in the state of Oregon to the tune of $180,000. So the question is, how will the new political order accommodate the rights of everyone? And with us tonight we have Professor Mark Hall, who is Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics and Faculty Fellow in the William Penn Honors Program at George Fox University. He has written, edited, or co-edited a number of books. I'll just give you some of the titles. The Political and Legal Philosophy of James Wilson, The Founders on God and Government, Collected Works of James Wilson, The Forgotten Founders on Religion and Public Life, The Sacred Rights of Conscience, Selected Readings on Religious Liberty and Church-State Relations, America's Forgotten Founders, Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic, Faith and Founders of the American Republic, and forthcoming, The Collected Works of Roger Sherman. I don't know where Mark finds time to do much else, but somehow he does. And Mark has a number of works that are also forthcoming. Mark has written not only on the question of religion and politics, but also constitutional law. He recently had published a particularly excellent searching of the basis of the First Amendment and the basis of the First Amendment, which I recommend. He's also editor of more than 50 journal articles, book chapters, reviews, and sundry pieces. He's also a senior fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion, as well as an affiliate scholar at the John Jay Institute. Mark comes to us from a long way away, from Oregon, and he had occasion to be in the state of Michigan and was kind enough to join us tonight to work through this topic with us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Hall.
Thank you very much, Glenn, and I appreciate you all being out here on the second day of the semester. Not the ideal time to have a lecture, but I was out here dropping my own daughter off for college. That's an exciting time for me. I hope you all recognize what a great scholar Glenn is as well in political theory and church-state issues. When Cambridge University Press recently asked Daniel Dreisbach, a frequent collaborator of mine, and me to edit a book on great Christian jurists in American history, one of the very first people we went to was Glenn, and he's agreed to do a chapter. Glenn doesn't know this. Most authors only have to profile one jurist. We actually asked him to do 2 in one chapter. John Cotton and Roger Williams sort of doing double duty for us. I'm very, very sorry to hear about the memorial, and I'll make sure to wrap it up at 7:45. What I want to do tonight is I want to focus in on a set of potential conflicts that have been coming about because of the legalization of same-sex marriage in America. I want to focus in on private individuals and organizations. So I want to leave to the side for a minute public officials, such as a clerk that Glenn mentioned down in Kentucky who's refusing to issue wedding licenses. So I'm going to first lay out 3 different sets of conflicts or potential conflicts, and then I'm going to suggest how America's history of dealing with religious liberty issues suggests a way forward, a way that I think could pretty well protect the right of same-sex attracted Americans and Americans with religious convictions. So I'm not saying one over the other, but I'm saying both. And so I'll try to lay that out in 40 minutes or so. Let me begin by one potential set of conflicts that I don't think really we have much to fear about, that is if we care about religious liberty, and the oral arguments in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges, the case that requires every state in the Union to recognize same-sex wedding ceremonies. During the oral arguments, Justice Scalia asked Mary Bonato, who was representing the same-sex couple, so this is an ACLU-type attorney fighting for gay rights. Scalia said, and I'll quote, paraphrase actually, is it possible that a clergy, if we rule in favor of the same-sex couple, is it possible that a clergy could ever be forced to officiate at a same-sex wedding ceremony? And the gay rights activist said this. She said, no clergy is forced to marry any couple they don't want to marry. We have those protections in place. Over the last year or so, I've read that's probably too much of a claim, but I've read a heck of a lot of the literature by activists arguing for same-sex marriage, arguing that bakers and florists and whatnot should have to serve same-sex couples. Almost no one, I almost want to say no one, suggests that clergy should be forced to officiate at same-sex wedding ceremonies, or that houses of worship, at synagogues, at mosques, or churches should be forced to have these sorts of ceremonies against their will. So this is a fear that's brought out sometimes, but I would say, even in your lifetimes, this is really not much of a threat to religious liberty, because even the most adamant homosexual rights advocate understands that if religious liberty means anything, it means that the state can't tell the minister that he or she has to officiate a ceremony that he or she objects to on the basis of religious conviction. So I just don't see this as much of a threat going anywhere. On the other hand, when we move from clergy and houses of worship to religious organizations, perhaps private religious colleges like Calvin College or Thomas Aquinas College here in the state of Michigan, here the threats I think are, if we go from no threat, maybe we start flashing the yellow lights, potential threat, real problems, potentially real problems ahead. One of the chief fears of institutions like this, and one could, I just named a couple of religious colleges, but it can go on to all sorts of other religious organizations, World Vision, University, and all sorts of other ones. One of the key threats, and it would be a threat for Northwood University as well, one of the key things private organizations have going for them is their tax-exempt status. All sorts of great tax advantages it gives people. I understand Northwood just had a major capital campaign to raise $72 or so million. When people give to Northwood University, they get a tax deduction. They get to write it off their taxes. This is incredibly valuable. Whereas if people were to give me $72 million, that would be great for me, but they wouldn't have any tax advantage, right? I'm not a 501c3 organization. So one of the chief threats that might come about is that organizations like Calvin College that might say, look, we're not going to hire professors who are in a same-sex wedding, that are in a same-sex relationship, or that are married to someone else of the same sex. Then the IRS might come and yank away their tax-exempt status. And this is just not simply an abstract fear. We saw something very similar to this in the famous Bob Jones case back in 1983. Probably most of you all have heard of Bob Jones University. It's a private university, a religious school, really a fundamentalist school down in South Carolina. Interestingly enough, founded in the 1920s or so, from its earliest days, it would admit Asians, and whites and other ethnic minorities, but not African Americans. There's indisputably some racism going on. As we approach the 1970s, Bob Jones kind of sees the writing on the wall, handwriting on the wall, and they say, okay, fine, 1970, we'll start amending marrying African Americans, but not single African Americans. Now, 1975, Bob Jones finally says, okay, we'll admit single African Americans, but it is a religious conviction based on biblical text, such as Numbers 12, verse 1, that races should not intermarry. There should be no interracial marriage. And this prohibition, of course, would apply to whites as well as Asians as well as African Americans, right? No interracial dating, no interracial marriage. And they looked at verses. I would never interpret verses like this in this way, but they did. Numbers 12:1, Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman who he had married, or he had married an Ethiopian woman. And they worked from this to say no interracial dating. A profoundly erroneous interpretation of these texts. And yet, Bob Jones held to it as a matter of religious conviction. And they said, no one, we aren't going to let white students who come here date African Americans or African Americans date whites. You see how it's equally binding. But the IRS said it's still racism. Bam, no tax exempt status for you, Bob Jones University. Bob Jones University did survive. It didn't go under. And about 10 years ago, I think it was, they finally repudiated this erroneous interpretation of the Bible, erroneous from my perspective. Anyway, Bob Jones did have it stay in court and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, but by an 8-1 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court said what Bob Jones University did was wrong and what the IRS did was right. All right, so that's 1983. Let's go back to the Obergefell oral arguments. Now Samuel Alito gets in the act. And he says, and here I quote, well, in the Bob Jones case, the court held that a college was not entitled to tax-exempt status if it opposed interracial marriage or interracial dating. So would the same apply to a university or college if it opposed same-sex marriage? To which the Solicitor General of the United States, do you hear what it is? The Solicitor General of the United States said, well, I can't answer that question without knowing more, but it's certainly going to be an issue. I don't deny that. It's certainly going to be an issue. So the Solicitor General of the United States is pretty much saying, yeah, that same logic could apply. The IRS could determine that this sort of policy is discriminatory, and bam, Calvin College, Aquinas College no longer has 501c3 status. And it's very likely, if this sort of policy was applied nationwide, that lots of private Christian colleges would go under. Now, it's true that since this time, the commissioner of the IRS has been hauled before the House, hauled before the Senate. He's been asked, are you going to follow this sort of logic? And he said several times, a fellow named John Koskinen has said, no, there are no plans at this time to pursue this sort of action. Literally, he's always careful, and I don't blame him. He's probably a prudential fellow, but every time, if you look at the transcripts, he's always said, at this time, there is no plan to do this sort of thing. So I think this is a real potential threat to the ability of private citizens to organize religious colleges along all sorts of denominational lines, right? Calvinism, Roman Catholicism. I teach at a Christian college in the Quaker tradition, right? We have various beliefs that we hold near and dear as a matter of biblical interpretation and theology. The ability of organizations to organize themselves and have at least as one of their beliefs that individuals ought not to engage in same-sex relationships or marriage could well be threatened. What I think I want to focus on, though, is I understand Northwood is all about business. It's all about learning how to be a successful entrepreneur or manager, this sort of thing. I want to talk about private businesses. So if churches and religious synagogues, mosques, clergy, imams, if they are not under any threat, if private religious organizations are in a tenuous position, private businesses have been given almost no protection as a matter of law from laws that prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Now, some of you might be saying, well, why would this ever come about? And indeed, for many people, you just might start a business, run the business, and think nothing of whom you serve, how you go about business. But there are people out there who say that our faith ought to impact everything we do. It's not just for Saturday or Sunday or Friday night. Our entire business ought to be governed by our faith. The Kleins, the owner of the Sweet Cakes bakery, I had a chance to have a lunch with them a couple months ago. And this is what they articulated to me. We want to run our bakery for the glory of God. We want everything we do within this bakery to be for the glory of God. Last fall, I was called in to be an expert witness in the case of Baronel Stutzman, whom we see right here. A darling woman, 65, 70 or so years old. She's been a florist for 35 years. Over the last 9 years, she knowingly and willingly served a same-sex couple. So she knew this one guy was dating the other guy. The guy would come in and say, oh, my boyfriend's having a birthday, and she would help design the flowers. My boyfriend and I are having an anniversary. What should I do for him? Oh, well, why don't you have these sorts of flowers? So she did like $4,500 worth of business with these two men. All right? She hires homosexuals. So this is not just a homophobic thing. All right? However, she was faced with a dilemma. In 2012, after Washington had legalized same-sex marriage, she heard through the grapevine that these two men, whom she had served many times, were going to get married, and they wanted her to do the flowers. So she heard this ahead of time. She went home and talked to her husband, and she prayed, and she came to this conclusion. And here I quote, "My faith teaches me that marriage is between one man and one woman. Marriage is a sacred covenant between a man and a woman, as Christ is to the church. To create and design something from my heart to help celebrate their marriage would be dishonoring to God and my convictions." Now, you don't have to agree with that position, but hopefully we can respect how she might come to that sort of position from a sort of traditional Christian understanding of marriage. So when this man came, she didn't hide from him. She went out and she kind of stopped him before he ever asked her, and she said, "I'm sorry, I just can't do your wedding." And she gave him a hug, and she gave him a referral. She took the time to find a florist that would gladly do this wedding. All right? Now, in a world of adults, one would hope this would be the end of it, right? These two men go to the other floor, she goes back to her work, and we don't have to have massive lawsuits. In fact, in this case, the Attorney General of Washington, who would never get involved in a case of this sort of magnitude, and by magnitude I mean really, really small, came down on her like a ton of bricks. The ACLU came to these two men and got them to engage in a lawsuit against her, which she lost a couple months ago, $135,000 in an injunction against ever doing this sort of thing again. Which puts her in a dilemma, right? This woman who's been a florist for 35 years, this is more or less all she knows. She's a high school graduate. It's not like she has a ton of options at age 65 or so. Is faced with perhaps having to leave this business, or at least leave an important part of the business, so as to not run afoul of the injunction. Incidentally, let me suggest something, and I've actually queried. I queried the clients about this. I haven't had the chance to query Stutzman. I actually asked the clients, I said, look, what if two heterosexual men came in and said, we want to get married for the tax advantages of getting married. Would you do our wedding ceremony? They said, of course not. It's not a matter of sexual orientation. It's a matter of how God designed marriage between one man and one woman. It's not a matter of sexual orientation. This argument has had no weight in the Washington and Oregon courts or the Colorado courts, which there have been a whole host of these. Glenn mentioned the Sweet Cakes. There's a T-shirt case in Kentucky, a photographer case down in New Mexico. So these things have been popping up. All right, so private businesses. This is where the courts have offered the least amount of protection. All right, so those of you who plan to go out and enter the world of business, particularly if you want to start your own business, to the extent to which you have religious convictions that might run afoul of participating in same-sex marriage, this is where the danger is greatest. And there's other sorts of dangers as well. Well, what I want to do is just take a step back and look at American history for about 20 minutes. I'm going to give a greatly abbreviated version of what I could give you. I spent a lot of time preparing to be an expert witness, looking at how American legislatures and courts have tended to deal with usually minorities who run afoul of general laws. So the state passes a law intended for good, intended to advance the common good. But lo and behold, there's a small group of people here that can't abide by that law. What do you do? All right, what do you do? Let me give a real-life example. I come, I mentioned, from a Quaker school, a school owned by the Quakers, a Friends, a Society of Friends. If you know anything about the Quakers, you probably know that they're pacifists. If you know anything about early American history, you know that there are lots of military threats to these early frontier settlements. Accordingly, every colony required every male to serve in the militia. All right? To serve in the militia, to muster, to practice, to be prepared to defend Rhode Island or Virginia or Massachusetts Bay or whatnot. Well, you got a little problem here. You got these Quakers that say, we are pacifists. We can't do this. Now, what are we going to do about this? Well, there's really three options as I see it. There might be more, but three obvious options. One is you say, to heck with the religious convictions. Serve in the militia, or you go to jail. Or maybe we shoot you. And unfortunately, far too many countries have done this. You can imagine if you're in the Soviet Union or China today and say, oh, I don't think I can serve in the militia or the military because of my religious convictions, you're not going to have a very sympathetic ear. You'll find yourself in jail. But that is a solution, right? Just absolutely ignore the religious conviction. The other possibility, though, would be to say, okay, well, religious liberty is such a high value that we'll just get rid of this militia service requirement. Nobody has to serve in the militia. Well, that would protect our friends the Quakers, but it might leave the colonies unguarded. And this would not be a very good outcome if, in fact, the state law really does promote the common good. Fortunately, even in early America, I think Americans at their best have taken a third approach. They've said, why don't we leave this militia service requirement in place, but we'll craft an accommodation, a protection for this small group. And in this case, early on, what they said is this. They said, okay, fine, Quakers, you don't have to serve in the militia as long as you pay a fine or find a substitute. As we go through American history, what we find is that this accommodation becomes all the more generous. So by the time you get to World War I, basically they say, look, if you're a religious pacifist, you can do non-combatant service. You don't have to pay a fine, you still have to serve, but we won't force you to fight against your conscience. All right, I would love to have time to flesh this out a little bit, but let me run on. And what I want to do is I want to give you just a few other examples of where we've done this sort of thing. In about a week or two, the Heritage Foundation is going to publish a version of this section of the talk with full documentation and lots more examples. So for now, I just want to simply assert, this is America acting at its finest, making accommodations to protect those individuals with religious convictions that run afoul of general, mutually applicable laws. All right, let me just give you a couple of examples. Oaths, the oath requirement. Historically, oaths have been seen as central for Commonwealth safety and security, for the well-functioning of the judicial system. President George Washington, for instance, wrote in his famous farewell address, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indisputable supports. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, the reputation for life, if the sense of religious obligation deserts the oaths, which are instruments for investigating in the courts of justice? So the main part I want to emphasize is that last part. George Washington said we can't imagine the courts functioning effectively without oaths, given, understood as an oath is before God, God is the enforcer of the oath. Okay, you better tell the truth, you better be honest. Okay, well, let's return to our Quaker friends. Our Quaker friends, again, if you know two things about the Quakers, you know they're pacifists, and you might also know they don't take oaths. They take literally verses like James 5:12, but above all things, my brethren, neither swear, neither by heaven nor earth, neither by any oath, but let your yea be yea and your nay be nay. Neither swear by any oath. The Apostle James is telling us this. Gosh, as a good Christian, I ought not to take an oath. And so the Quakers refused to take oaths. They simply said, we will not do this. This got them into a lot of trouble back in England as they're asked to take oaths, say, for instance, after the Glorious Revolution to the new regime. And they say, no, we can't. Tens of thousands of Quakers are thrown in jail. When they're asked to testify in court, again, they're thrown in jail. They're sincere in their religious convictions. Well, what should we do about this? Now, don't ask me to defend this distinction, but my Quaker friends make it. They say, look, as Quakers, we will not take an oath, but we don't mind giving an affirmation to affirm that what we're saying is true. They see this as different than an oath. All right, so in America, again, actually to begin with in England, to be fair, but then very early on, in the early 17th century, the state started allowing Quakers in criminal proceedings and civil proceedings as they run for civic office to offer an affirmation rather than an oath. Again, if you take in Glenn Moots on the U.S. Constitution, you know that our Constitution contains a religious accommodation clearly aimed at Quakers and Moravian and Brethren and those others that refuse to take oaths. The presidential oath of office, I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute. There's 3 different oaths in the U.S. Constitution. All of them have this accommodation for those who cannot take oaths. Now you might object, and you'll be accurate to say anyone can take advantage of this. You can be as secular as a broomstick and affirm rather than swear. So clearly, this isn't something only intended for Quakers, but clearly in the context of the time, this was aimed at Quakers and those that had these religious obligations to oaths. Well, if we can agree on anything, we can agree that school is important. What we see in the 19th century is that states started saying, look, school is so important that we were going to pass laws requiring people to go to school, right? Maybe through the age of 16. It's really, really important. Now, this doesn't make as much sense to you all, probably, because you're familiar with all sorts of private schools, you're familiar with homeschooling and so forth. You turn back the clock to the 1960s, it is often really, really hard to get a private school, to get it accredited and whatnot. And homeschooling is just not known. It's virtually unknown in America. Well, if you take this reality and couple it with the fact that in many ways American schools became far more secular in the 1960s, and they even started embracing all sorts of teachings that at least some religious Americans found very offensive or problematic. I mean, you're kind of forced into an interesting dilemma, into an interesting problem. You have to send your kids to school, but schools undermine your religious convictions. A case of this nature made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, Wisconsin versus Yoder, the Amish. I saw some billboards advertising Amish furniture on my way here. I gather you have Amish around here, plenty of Amish down in Pennsylvania, of course, in Wisconsin. The Amish sort of freeze the clock in, about the 16th century or so. They're profoundly skeptical of the modern world. They go around in horse and buggies. They refuse to wear buttons because they're too flashy. The Amish in Wisconsin did not object to sending their kids to school, the local school, through K through 8. They thought this was fine. Reading, writing, arithmetic, you need to know that. But they said, look, as a matter of sincere religious conviction, we cannot send our kids to the public high school. This is going to undermine their faith. The U.S. Supreme Court came and weighed in on this and basically said, virtually unanimous, 8.5 to 1.5, that Wisconsin has to create an accommodation for these Amish. You don't have to abolish the mandatory attendance law. That promotes the common good, at least theoretically, right? So, Baptists and others who are out there, they still have to send their kids to school through the age of 16. But in the case of the Amish, where we have these sincere religious convictions that no one doubts, we're going to say to Wisconsin, you can't require them to continue on in public education. In each of these areas, an important part of my argument that I'm skipping over my need for haste, so we see accommodations made for Quakers with respect to military service and others, of course. We see accommodations to the oath requirement. We see accommodations to mandatory school attendance. I don't think anyone would argue that these accommodations have hurt the public good, that they've hurt the Commonwealth. We've still managed to educate children, to fight and win wars, to have a functioning judicial system, and these minor accommodations haven't particularly hurt that. Let me rush on to something that might seem really odd to you, compulsory religious acts. Now you see these images, and you might be thinking on my left here, you might be thinking Hitler Youth, right? It sure looks like that sort of... All right, hopefully that will stay. Is that all right? The salute of the American flag. These are American children. And in coming up to World War II, a number of American states said national unity is really important. So we are going to require all school children to say the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag, to salute the American flag. Almost none of us have any problem with that, but there is a group out there that does, the Jehovah's Witnesses. They believe that saluting and pledging allegiance to the American flag is the same thing as worshiping Baal. Again, we might not accept that theological view, but that is a view that they indisputably have. They consider worshiping graven image in direct contradistinction to, say, Exodus 20, verses 4 and 5. In this case, we to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1940, the U.S. Supreme Court said 8-1, national security is so important that it overrides this right to religious liberty. So, yeah, it's interesting. 3 years later, in a massive about-face, the court heard the exact same case in West Virginia versus Barnett, and the U.S. Supreme Court came to the opposite conclusion. The Supreme Court said this: basically, religious liberty is so important that in this case, you can't require these Jehovah's Witnesses to go against their religious convictions. You can require everyone else to salute the American flag, to pledge allegiance to the American flag. So this general policy that's in place, presumably to promote national unity, that's okay, but you have to exempt these Jehovah's Witnesses from this requirement. And as you know, we won that war, so presumably it was not in fact necessary for doing so. There's some great quotes here. I'm just going to run on to give you a brief overview of some of these other areas. Alcohol and drugs have done untold devastation in America, particularly when used in excess. America eventually prohibited alcohol. It's telling, though, that even in the Volstead Act, which implemented prohibition, there's a clear exemption for those who would use sacramental wine, specifically rabbis, priests, and ministers of the gospel using wine. Now, a lot of you are Protestants. You might say, what's the big deal? We just use grape juice. But there are actually some pretty large Christian bodies that say, no, Jesus said wine, we actually use wine, right? And so these are specifically protected. Drugs, on the other hand, drugs are nasty, right? A lot of people understand that drugs are really, really bad. A drug like peyote, you see the little peyote flower there. Native Americans, at least in some tribes, have used peyotes for centuries. This is well documented. They've used peyote for centuries in religious ceremonies. The federal government, peyote is a Schedule C narcotic. It's clearly illegal, clearly bad stuff. But the federal government back in the 60s recognized that, yeah, we're going to make it illegal, but we'll make an accommodation for these Native Americans. And so on federal, Native Americans could use peyote. A lot of states did as well. My home state, the great state of Oregon, didn't. And so one Native American fellow, Mr. Smith, was arrested for using peyote and involved in unemployment insurance and such, but we won't go into the details. Basically, the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and in a very disappointing decision, the court ruled 5-4 against the Native American. The court said, hey, it's a drug law. The drug law is in place. The state could make an accommodation, but the state didn't. So Mr. Smith is up a creek without a paddle. Go to jail, Mr. Smith. Too bad for you. Religious liberty at its best is an American value. It's not a democratic value. It's not a Republican value. You can be excused for thinking it's a Republican value if you watch some of the current debates. A great example of this is the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, passed 2 years after Smith to protect Mr. Smith and people like him. The Congress overwhelmingly, with a unanimous vote in the House, 97-3 in the Senate, and a bill signed into place by Democratic President Bill Clinton, said this. It basically said, look, if you have a neutral law that runs afoul of a religious conviction, the state has to show a compelling interest, a really, really good interest, a powerful reason to implement this law and to do it in the least intrusive means possible. Something clearly, and this is a direct response to Smith. Fortunately, the great state of Oregon finally got its act together and it passed an accommodation to protect Mr. Smith as well. All right, so again, even in areas such as drug use, states and the national government have recognized we should carve out accommodations for religious actors. I could say similar things with respect to medical treatment. 47 states permit parents that have religious objections to vaccinations to not vaccinate their children, as important as vaccines are. I should mention, you might hear me as saying religious liberty trumps all. It doesn't. Let me give you one example where it shouldn't trump all. In the early 20th century, the Christian Scientists very effectively lobbied many state legislatures. Christian Scientists, if you don't know, I'm not talking about a scientist who is a Christian, but a member of the First Church of Christ Science, a sect within Christianity. They believe that all illness is spiritual and not physical. And so therefore the proper way to treat illness is through prayer and not medicine. They successfully lobbied in many, many states to protect parents who did not get medical treatment for their children. But literally, and unfortunately, literally hundreds of children died throughout the 20th century because of these religious accommodations. And so states very appropriately said no. No Christian scientist. If your children have pneumonia, you have a legal obligation to take them to the doctor and get them penicillin. We are not going to create a religious accommodation for you. I think that's absolutely appropriate. The state has a very powerful interest in protecting the life and well-being of its children. The beliefs of the Christian scientists should be respected, but sometimes even a religious conviction needs to be overridden. The very last area, a fascinating area, are medical providers. Shortly after Roe versus Wade was decided, people recognized that very rapidly the receipt of federal funds might be used to force hospitals and doctors to engage in practices like abortion. Senator Frank Church, a Democrat from Idaho, said this is a problem. And he led Congress to pass what are known as the Church Amendments. That basically said this: the receipt of federal funds can never be used to require an individual to perform an abortion or sterilization, or to require an institution to perform these sorts of procedures as well. He said in these debates, nothing is more fundamental to our national birthright than the freedom of religion. Religious belief must remain above the reach of secular authority. Congress has said it's broadened these what are called medical conscience clauses to protect doctors and nurses and medical students and pharmacists in some cases from having to engage in acts that they have religious or moral convictions as well against. Again, as within all these areas, it's hard to argue that any of these accommodations have hurt significantly the advancement of the common. Well, believe it or not, we have religious exemptions of civil rights laws. I won't talk about those right now. Let me briefly head towards a way of wrapping up. Okay, so what does this have to do? How might we resolve these problems? I'm going to stipulate right now that states have an interest in prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. I think that's a very reasonable conclusion for a state to reach. I'll point out, this isn't often well understood, that only half the states have recognized this. Only about 25 states have laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Michigan, if I understand the law correct, doesn't have such a law. So a store owner could simply refuse to hire someone because of sexual orientation and would not be running afoul of any state law or any federal law. There's no federal law of this sort in mind. But nonetheless, I'm going to stipulate that there is such a state interest. States have been pretty rapidly passing these sorts of statutes, and so the state has an interest in this. I want to also argue, though, and I hopefully have demonstrated a bit, that states have a profound interest in protecting religious liberty. Again, what do? Do you say we aren't going to have these sorts of laws? I would say there's a couple of different ways in which we could address this. Probably the most sensible way at this point. There's a number of things. Let me just, the First Amendment Defense Act would protect colleges like Calvin College, Thomas Aquinas College. We can talk more about that with respect to tax exempt status. With respect to businesses, I know a number of you are interested in business, I think. A lot of religious conservatives really like these Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, just like the one back in 1993, signed by Bill Clinton. I kind of like them as well. However, Indiana recently entertained one, and there was a huge firestorm, and all sorts of crazy hypotheticals were raised, and the state ended up backing away in very important ways from this. Given this overreaction, what I would suggest, the best way forward is this: that as states pass these laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, it should also pass narrow accommodations, aimed at protecting most obviously ministers and churches, but also religious organizations, and even, I dare say, private businesses whose owners might have religious convictions against participating in certain sorts of religious ceremonies. Now note here, a narrowly crafted accommodation wouldn't allow a grocery store owner to simply refuse to sell food to a homosexual on the basis of some sort of irrational animus, right? We would be talking about requirements to participate in what many Americans would see as a fundamentally religious ceremony. I think carefully crafted accommodations, narrow crafted accommodations, could actually protect religious Americans and leave these protections in place. One final virtue of these, and I'll conclude with this, You think about the states that have passed these laws banning prohibited discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. They tend to be the more liberal states, the blue states, right? California, Oregon, Washington, New England. It's going to be really hard to pass these sorts of laws throughout the Midwest and throughout the South if religious Americans think they're going to be used to discriminate or to harm religious Americans, right? Whereas if we can alleviate these concerns, if we can say to people in Alabama and Oklahoma and Arkansas, look, florists aren't going to be put in jail or fined, given ruinous fines for refusing to participate in a same-sex wedding ceremony, it becomes far more likely that these states will pass laws banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The great example of that, of course, is Utah, one of the most conservative states in the land that recently passed a law banning such discrimination, probably only because it also had protections for religious Americans built into the law. All right, so I will stop there, and I understand a number of you might need to go to the memorial service. I encourage you to do so. Anyone who's interested in staying behind, I'll stay here as long as people would like, and we can chat, argue, whatever. So you're dismissed.
Those of you that are leaving, if you could, yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. Okay, for those of you that are sticking around, I just want to make a quick plug for some of our future forum programming. September 17th in here, we have a Constitution Day lecture with Jim Caesar from UVA. On October 6th, we'll actually address this topic again. We have a debate, is gay marriage good for America, between someone from Heritage Foundation and someone from the Cato Institute. And then November 2nd, we have a debate on the minimum wage, and November 10th, we have a debate on immigration. So if you want to take those dates down, and with that, that's our intermission. Go back tomorrow.
All right. Well, that seemed too cramped. I'm sorry, I kind of had to rush there at the end. I rushed over a lot of my examples. I would be happy to flesh out anything you'd like me to flesh out, and certainly to entertain any questions or objections. I'm very happy to engage in a dialogue about these very controversial issues. Any questions? Objections? Yes, sir, in the very back.
One of the things that, because I'm retired military reserve, I track a lot of things, and there are some things in the military where there's certain, I'm going to say, cases where there's some pressure on Catholics to form same-sex ceremony, but once again, I think it should be something to do it, but there's some pressure coming on there. So you've got a different structure there, too.
There is, absolutely, and I have good news for you. I forget the exact title, but the Military Reauthorization Act of 2012 specifically protects military chaplains. The language is something to the effect of no one can be forced to officiate at a wedding to which he or she has religious objections. So obviously that covers perhaps a wide range of weddings, but I think the clear intent in this case was to say military chaplain can't be forced to marry two men or two women against his or her religious convictions. Yes, sir.
Well, you're from Oregon, very liberal. You're from a religious college, I suspect at least somewhat conservative. Your Attorney General was the one that pursued all the way to the Supreme Court, I'll say persecuting the florists. Based on everything you've described tonight, what's the solution in Oregon?
Actually, the florist case was Washington. That was Washington Attorney.
You got one down in Oregon too.
Oregon was the Sweet Cakes case. Hasn't involved the Attorney General yet. It was the Department of Labor and Industry in this case. I should say that both of these cases are being appealed. They certainly can be appealed to the level of state Supreme Courts, and then conceivably you can make certain federal claims and appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court eventually. So they aren't done deals. The Alliance Defending Freedom is all over both cases and putting a lot of resources behind them. I tend to be an optimist, and I think that Americans, even Washingtonians, generally have an understanding that the power of the state should be limited when it comes to religious conviction. And let me give you evidence out of the state of Washington. Washington is one of the 11 states that actually passed, the legislature passed a statute legalizing same-sex marriage. So it wasn't a decision made by a judge. It wasn't required by the U.S. Supreme Court. So it did this back in 2012. As it passed the statute, the state of Washington, the bluest of the blue states, one of the most secular states in the nation, they passed some protections. They specifically said no clergy, imam, rabbi shall be forced to celebrate or officiate a same-sex wedding ceremony. No house of worship shall be forced to host one. It went further. It said no religious organization, a place like Seattle Pacific University, can be forced to participate or celebrate in this sort of ceremony. So even the state of Washington recognized that it's really problematic to start telling churches, ministers, religious organizations that you have to do these things against your religious convictions. Where the state of Washington fell short, I think, was just a lot of people don't get the notion that private business people might want to run their businesses to the glory of God and therefore might want to draw certain lines. Interestingly enough, it's not many Americans. So in the state of Washington, I have a great quote that I skipped over. One of the leader of a gay rights activist, I have him quoted as saying something like this: there have been literally thousands of weddings in Washington. And this case, the Flores case, is one of the very few where anyone has objected to serving the same-sex couple. Why is this? If you think about it, if some of you are business owners, you know that businesses have profound incentives to serve customers. You want to have more customers. You don't want to turn them away. So even many people that have religious convictions that might say that marriage should be between one Christian man and one Christian woman aren't going to limit their business, their catering business, their florist business, to this particular pairing, right? So they're perhaps always serving a marriage between a Christian man and a non-Christian woman or whatever. Again, that might be right, that might be wrong, but most businesses don't think like Barron's Testament died. So we're talking about a very few cases. When you look at all of America, all the states with laws in their books prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, it's very, very, very few cases. And so my argument would be, and the hope would be, that you try to convince legislatures in these states that, look, we can pass narrow, careful accommodations to protect these religious citizens, and it really won't hurt the interest that Washington has declared that it has in prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And there are a couple other things legal scholars far smarter than I have suggested. In these narrow accommodations, you might take into account size. If Walmart refuses to participate in same-sex wedding ceremonies, that might create lots of problems throughout lots of places. But if we limit it to businesses with 15 or fewer employees or something like that, that would protect the vast majority of the real-life cases that we actually know about. You also, and this is a very controversial requirement, but if you think about the harm that was done to the men in this case, probably the greatest harm might be a dignitary harm, being turned away. In some sense, maybe they felt judged, right? Well, what you might do is require businesses that want to take advantage of these sorts of accommodations to advertise that fact, to say we only service opposite-sex wedding ceremonies. Now, that would probably be actually very detrimental to that business in the environment in which we live, which would pretty much ensure that only those people that have sincere religious convictions would take advantage of that. So that would be my argument. I would argue to state legislatures that we could craft these narrow accommodations, and the state can still meet its interest and it's determined in prohibiting discrimination on these terms. Again, we can see Utah maybe as a model for how that might actually play out. Yes, sir.
When the laws are written to protect the individuals, does it also protect the individual's facilities? I know many churches are concerned at this stage about being overrun with their facilities.
Yes, in the examples that I'm aware of, Washington clearly protects houses of worship, and then it even goes further to protect religious organizations. So, in Washington State, World Vision, Seattle Pacific, Whitworth, these are clearly protected as a matter of state law. So yeah, I would say, again, in my little dichotomy, I would say church, and when I say church, I mean broadly a house of worship, synagogue, a mosque, religious leaders such as ministers, priests, imams, rabbis. I just don't think there's much of any threat. I know in some conservative religious circles there's, people are trumpeting that this is a threat. I just don't think it really is much of one. That's not to say we shouldn't be vigilant. That's not to say we should insist that our legislatures pass protections to make it clear that priests and others can't be forced to engage in these sorts of things. I think we should. But I just, when I look, I spent a lot of time reading pretty ACLU type law professors and whatnot. They're gung-ho same-sex or marriage. And none of them are saying that priests and ministers should be forced to officiate in such ceremonies. I think they recognize it's beyond the pale, that it's something that the vast majority of Americans, even not particularly religious Americans, would say, you have got to be kidding me. Let me give you a decent example of this. It came out of, I think, the state of Illinois in the 1980s. There was a minister who, even at that late date, sort of like Bob Jones University, refused to do interracial marriages. The state's Human Rights Commission came after him, so he wouldn't marry a black person and a white person. The state's Human Rights Commission came after him and said, no, you have to marry a black person and a white person. The state went to the Illinois Supreme Court, and the Illinois Supreme Court said, and I paraphrase, you've got to be kidding. The state is not going to tell a minister whom he has to marry. It's just beyond the pale, I think. Yes?
I don't understand the rationale of this case by a county clerk whose job is to issue licenses. I don't understand what's the defense of that person.
I'm a huge advocate of religious liberty, but I have to say my sympathy is at its low ebb with her claims. So she's a county clerk who accepts this job. One of the many duties is issuing wedding licenses. It seems to me that it's a far different thing to say here's an employee of the state, employed to do certain things required by law to recognize these sorts of marriages, and she can't pick and choose between them. In the same way that if, let's say, a Christian and a non-Christian came to her for a wedding license, that she should not be free to say, oh, I'm sorry, I disagree with this marriage. I won't give you a license either. Yeah, I think the state interest is the most compelling in this sort of case. The religious liberty claim is at the low ebb. Now, with that said, in a number of states are looking at crafting an accommodation for such people to say something like this. If there is in this courthouse 4 people capable of issuing marriage licenses and one objects to this particular wedding license, she should be able to say, please talk to my colleague over here. So in this sort of situation, the same-sex couple is receiving their marriage license, and she's not forced to act against a religious conviction. I guess I would support that sort of accommodation for her. But again, I must say my sympathy is at its low ebb in this sort of case. Yes, sir.
I think the war is being fought the wrong way. That is too limited. We're talking about same-sex weddings, and we're talking about religious freedom. We should be talking about freedom, the freedom of the individual. If it's your own business, if these are my flowers, I can sell them to whomever I want, or refuse to sell them. I can keep them. Okay? If it's mine, if it's really mine, then I have the full rights to do business with you on the basis of whatever I choose, or to refuse on the basis of not just sexual orientation, but anything else. As I have the right to discriminate, as I discriminate in my private life, I have the right to discriminate in my private business.
There's a part of me that's very sympathetic with that line of argumentation. I think as part of it, as I've become a little, so I'm mostly an academic professor over here doing academic things. As I've been drawn into working with these attorneys that are litigating in real life cases and potentially in the position of giving policy advice to legislatures, I guess I'm acting in the presumption that politics is the art of the possible. We aren't going to move into this sort of idealistic libertarian regime anytime soon, and so what we should do is protect the most liberty as we possibly can at this stage in time. So this is very, very sympathetic to what you're saying.
It is about recognizing the power of the state to limit my private property rights. That is to deny me my
Right.
inalienable rights.
Yes, I understand exactly what you're saying, and I think we've gone pretty far down this path in the modern regulatory era in which we live. So I just think there's no hope of having what one might consider a proper view of the scope of government vis-a-vis individuals and individual businesses. And I must say, I tend to be maybe too much of an optimist, but I think the market would take care of a lot of the sort of odious racial discrimination and so forth that might come about, right? So you have a restaurant here in Midland that refuses to serve African Americans. I think that business would be out of business within 2 weeks, right? So I'm very sympathetic to your argument, but I think in the world in which we live, I'm going to fight for these relatively smaller and I think doable protections for religious liberty. Yes, sir.
I mean, of all things, when you claim religious liberty, why does it seem like same-sex marriage is always the thing that turns companies away? There's other sins that people commit that they could say, we don't want to sell this, we don't want to sell it to a divorced person or something like that. Why does it seem like, and you don't see anyone picketing for that or, having rallies against that, so why does it seem like same-sex marriage is the only thing they want to claim religious liberty for?
Yeah, well, first of all, of course, there's a whole host of religious liberty claims made in all sorts of areas. I skipped over the slide you might have noticed of the young woman who wanted to who wore, as a matter of religious conviction, a scarf, and Abercrombie and Finch said, oh, this violates the dress code, we aren't going to hire you. Well, lo and behold, it's a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You have the prisoner down in Arkansas who wanted to grow as a matter of religious conviction. So, but to get to your question, I think this is a hot button issue of the day, and so the media is going to be naturally drawn to these cases. I think they're precious few cases, and I think a critical thing to recognize, take the case of Barronville Stutzman. She did not object, and does not object, to serving homosexuals. But in her mind, a marriage ceremony is really almost an inherently religious ceremony. And she feels that she can do all the serve flowers and whatnot for homosexuals all day long and twice on Sunday, but as a matter of conscience, she can't participate in this inherently religious ceremony against her religious convictions. The only reason this became a big deal, of course, is because the Washington Attorney General and the ACLU got involved. If they didn't, the couple actually was given multiple offers of free flowers, so they weren't particularly put out. And so it's a hot button issue, so media's drawn attention to it. And I do think in the minds of the bakers, the photographer, that they drew lines between generally serving homosexuals and being involved in what they consider participation in a same-sex wedding ceremony. I've read all these transcripts. They go on and on and on. And the argument is there's a world of difference between someone walking into my store and buying a dozen roses to be used in a wedding and my traveling to the church and using my artistic talents to design the ideal floral arrangement for this wedding. This is a matter of participation in the ceremony. It's an artistic expression, which is another argument that has been raised in this law. So, yeah, that's my attempt to say why these relatively few cases out of the tens of thousands of same-sex marriages have garnered so much attention. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but my question was more just same-sex marriage as a whole. Why is that the one thing that always seems to violate religious liberty? Like why, over everything else that you could do to go against religious liberty, why is that the one thing some people are so against? Maybe that's too deep of a question for you to answer, but...
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Well, of course, we tend to think that businesses can't discriminate. And that's actually kind of false, right? Businesses can discriminate all they want to as a matter of law, except in those areas where the state says it can't, right? So, I can discriminate against people who aren't wearing shoes or aren't wearing shirts or who are rude to me and this sort of thing. But I can't discriminate on the basis of race, because this has been made illegal in 1960. I can't discriminate on the basis of gender. I can't discriminate on the basis of military service, right, if you're a veteran or not. And because of what 25 states have done, I can't discriminate legally on the basis of sexual orientation. So when I refuse to participate in a same-sex wedding ceremony, I'm running afoul of a law, and you have lawsuits and media involved and that sort of thing. But again, I think just because these are right before our face, we shouldn't think these are the only religious liberty cases. There's tons and tons of religious liberty cases all over the place. I don't know if this gets to your point, but it's an interesting case. So if you've ever flown through Minneapolis, St. Paul, there are lots and lots of people from Ethiopia that are generally Muslims who do lots of jobs, particularly, I guess, they've taken over the cab industry. These Muslim cabbies say, I can't transport people who are carrying alcohol if I know they're carrying alcohol. Interesting enough, right? So if I see someone waiting for a taxi holding a bottle of Jim Beam, I can't transport them. That's a violation of my religious conviction. Well, this became a huge hole, right? What's the issue here? Why not? Most Americans don't understand this. For at least some Muslims, it's a matter of conscience. The Minneapolis Port Authority, or whatever it's called, said, to heck with you. If you can't transport everyone, you don't get to transport anyone. And these Muslim cabbies have basically been denied privileges there. I think it's very reasonable to make a religious argument on their behalf. I think it would be an eminently sensible policy to say this. Look, if there are 50 cabbies waiting in line and someone comes with alcohol, and apparently they don't particularly care if the alcohol is buried away in a suitcase, it's not like they're querying, do you have alcohol? But if someone's obviously carrying alcohol, just let the second cab back take it, right? That would be a very reasonable accommodation to protect our Islamic brothers and sisters who should be free to drive a cab and yet still follow their religious convictions if it doesn't go against the common good. Now, if only there were Muslim cabbies that had this conviction, so no one carrying alcohol could ever get a ride from the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, then you might have to say this is a conviction we can't accomplish because people have a right to be able to get rides in taxi cabs. Yeah, so believe me, I'm very supportive of religious liberty for all Americans, not just Americans that have objections to same-sex wedding ceremonies. Yeah, Glenn?
I'll defer.
Okay, yes, sir.
It seems to me that if somebody is running a public business and they should have no right to discriminate against anybody for any reason, as long as that person can afford to pay for the service or product that the person is selling. Otherwise, they shouldn't be in that business. If they're opening up a business that serves the public, then they should not be able to discriminate to anybody who walks through their doors to purchase their service or product. Otherwise, they shouldn't be in that business.
Sure, no, fair enough. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the law is actually the exact opposite of what you just said. The law is that I'm free to discriminate all I want with respect to my business, except in those areas where the law steps in and says you can't do it here, you can't do it here, you can't do it here. Most notably, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, race, religion, gender, and now sexual orientation. So it's a state that's stepping in and saying you can't do this sort of thing. As the state steps in, the state oftentimes, again, disagrees with you. Washington, the bluest of the blue states, specifically says, okay, certainly these organizations are going to be protected. We're going to allow them to discriminate on various basis. Some states have crafted accommodations for these sorts of religious individuals. Even civil rights laws have what's called a Mrs. Smith's boarding house exception. That if you board fewer than like 5 people, you actually are allowed to discriminate on the basis of race. So if you read through the statute books, what you're going to find is the state is intimately involved in carving out all sorts of exceptions and protections and so forth. And I think on this matter, as I already mentioned, 25 states don't have laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Businesses in Midland can all they want refuse to serve homosexuals, and they are running afoul of any law. When Michigan passes a law banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, I might say that's a good thing, but it should create an accommodation within that law to protect these relatively few people that have religious convictions against participating in same-sex wedding ceremonies. But reasonable people can disagree on this. I do understand that. Yes, there's a question back here, a comment?
I have a question. When the Supreme Court made their decision, there was a lot of talk about now the churches are going to lose their tax exempt status. Can you speak on that?
Sure. Again, I was going way too fast, but that was what I was referring to when I mentioned the Bob Jones case, and Alito specifically asked, what about Christian colleges? The Solicitor General said, yes, that's going to be an issue. That specifically was about religious organizations like Calvin College, Thomas Aquinas College. If we go back earlier in the oral arguments to that first thing I mentioned, this homosexual rights activist said, of course, clergy aren't going to be forced to engage in these. And I think almost everyone agrees churches aren't going to be forced either. Again, you always have to be careful predicting the future, but I would say within our lifetimes, even the lifetimes of the youngest of us, churches and houses of worship are going to be very well protected. Their tax exempt status won't be yanked. The state's not going to try to compel them to engage in this sort of behavior. In some European countries, we've seen very different things, where ministers have been thrown in jail for daring to say homosexuality is against God's word. We have a very powerful protection of freedom of speech in America, where I don't think that will ever happen. The threat is to religious organizations, religious colleges, and it's particularly grave when we're talking about places of public business as a public accommodation for speakers and that sort of thing. All right, saw a few other hands. Yeah.
Mark, I think the boogeyman in this discussion is obviously Jim Crow and separate facilities, racially segregated facilities. Could you help us disentangle these two kinds of discrimination, where once we begin to talk about accommodation, we don't start thinking, are we going to set the clock back to 1962 or 1950? How should we disentangle those two kinds of discrimination?
Yeah, no, that's a very tricky question. When I was deposed by the ACLU attorneys, this is where they time and time kept turning to, well, what if a white store owner has a religious objection against serving an African American? What if an Indian store owner has a religious objection against serving a Muslim, and so forth and so on? Yeah, because you want to equate those two, right? Discrimination is discrimination. It's all wrong, and so forth. I think that, again, this is a very difficult argument to make, but I think when we're looking at the sort of harms that have been done, the public policies that have been adopted to address those harms, you can make a very plausible argument that the lot of African Americans who were brought on the dreaded Middle Passage in chains, held as property for years, that even after emancipation you had a regime of law that was in place for over a century, holding these people down. That even outside of the laws, you had literally thousands of lynchings throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. That the sort of discrimination, particularly against African Americans, maybe more broadly on the basis of race, is such a grave evil that there's a highest of state interest in getting involved in these and overriding a religious liberty claim to the contrary. Certainly one can point to discrimination against homosexuals and even violence against homosexuals, but I just think as you weigh those two, you could reasonably come to the conclusion that there's a different level of state interest. So that's at least one way of approaching it. The other is, and I want to emphasize that I think, if you follow the sort of logic that I'm making, again, I find racial discrimination odious, but I still don't think, say, a Catholic priest, Catholic disposition, a Baptist minister, should be forced to officiate at a wedding between a black person and a white person against his religious convictions. I think we could craft an accommodation that says, look, the state is not going to tell ministers of the gospel who to marry or how to marry or what sort of, the Roman Catholic Church considers marriage a sacrament. We certainly aren't going to say what sort of sacraments a priest has to engage in. And just as we might do that within this policy area, we might very carefully expand into other policy areas to craft narrow accommodations. So I'm actually, in theory, I like broad religious freedom restoration acts, like the national one and the ones about 25 states have adopted. But whenever you start talking about those, you can start bringing up these boogeymen. And so I think it gets us a bit away from the boogeymen to say, okay, let's just start talking about narrow accommodation. And believe me, in my larger report, you would not believe the number of accommodations that are made in all sorts of areas. One of the funnest ones, or interesting ones I found, some of you, if you come from farm stock, will appreciate there are laws on the books to protect animals and how they are killed. So contrary to your ideal saying, this is my cow, I'll do to her what I want, no, you can't, not as a matter of law, right? You can't torture her, you can't even kill her as you want. There are humane ways of killing cows that are required by law. In the statutes I've seen, all of them have exceptions, religious accommodations for ritualistic slaughter. How many religions engage in ritualistic slaughter today? Precious few. Santeria down in Florida, some sects of Jews. But even so, these legislatures have said, look, these very few people have these sorts of religious beliefs that might lead them to kill a cow or a chicken in a different way. We're going to protect their religious convictions. Again, there's just, by one count, there are over 2,000 of these sorts of narrow accommodations. And so I think that's probably the prudential way to better protect religious liberty, even as states seek to prohibit discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Yes, sir.
So the solution is just to declare your business a church or some kind of a religious institution and then do whatever you want.
Well, I think, in my mind, and I think we have the greatest, I think virtually every American agrees that houses of worship and clergy should not be compelled by the state to engage in practices against their religious convictions. I think religious organizations, there's pretty widespread commitment as well. So these are the two logical places to go. The tough battle becomes businesses, which, as this gentleman has said, you open a bakery, you sort of commit to serve the public. There's a common law tradition, particularly with respect to inns and transportation, taxes and whatnot. This is, particularly inns, this goes back hundreds of years. Can't just turn away people willy-nilly for good reasons, right? In 17th century England, you're walking along from town to town, you come to the one inn within 25 miles, the innkeeper has an obligation, the common law says, to host you. These public accommodation doctrines have been expanded to other things. And so I think to sort of fight back against it, yeah, we should create accommodations within them. But I really appreciate people who are making the broader philosophical arguments that maybe this isn't even a game we should be playing. So believe me, I appreciate very much where you're coming from.
Well, thanks everyone for sticking around and joining me in thanking our colleagues.
Thank you all.